Welcome back to Class 2 on the Apostle Paul. I want to start with just a quick review of what we talked about last week, just a 5-minute summary, and then move into sort of where we left off. Muriel, come on up front if you want. Oh, see, I told you. I said no one likes to sit up front. You're happy.
I won't bite.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about that after. This is what happens. You come late to class, we embarrass you. Yeah, that's right. All right, so quick review. The Apostle Paul was not always an apostle, right? He was initially an Israelite, living in the Greek diaspora, that is sort of not in Jerusalem and Judea, but in the Greek-speaking world, probably around Tarsus, Damascus, sort of north of there. If you look at your map, I'm all the way on the right edge of that map. Right, so you see at the bottom there, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, Nazareth, that's Jesus' territory, right? Jesus and the 12 territory. Up north there, you've got Antioch, Syria, Tarsus around the edge there in what is now southern Turkey. That's sort of where Paul is, okay? He's a persecutor. He's someone who is vigorously and righteously Jewish. He is deeply educated. He is involved. That is his milieu. That is his world. Okay? He then has this conversion experience, this call that he experiences that sends that in a whole new direction. Right? So he's all of a sudden goes from persecuting to promoting the church. But we spent some time last week talking about those mysterious early years, which were a significant chunk of his ministry. Right? He says, I had this experience of seeing Jesus, and he sort of pointed me in this new direction, and so I went into Arabia for 3 years, that is, out into the desert, and then he confers a little bit, and he's feeling this call to the Gentiles, which we talked about is a big shift, right? This expansion of the covenant that was the covenant between God and the chosen people, right, the Israelites. Could that be accessed now by others? Be they Gentiles or different types of Jews or whoever it was back then. And Paul says, yes, there's some negotiation, some conversation that has to happen, but they end up agreeing, yes, you can go be an apostle to the Gentiles. Peter and James, Jesus' brother, will focus in Jerusalem on being an apostle to the people of Israel. But what that makes is these two tracks, almost, of early Christianity. And we will see both then and last week and today, we saw how having those two tracks could lead to some points of conflict that were not resolved yet. Just because they agreed didn't mean that everything was resolved. But he's going and doing that. But then he says he spends another 10 to 14 years. It's unclear whether he spends 14 years total, including those 3 years in Arabia before the Apostolic Council, or whether there's another 14 years. That's some of the discrepancy. But that's a long time. Right, especially because the letters we have are condensed into just a few years of his ministry. So the majority of his ministry happened in the dark to us. We don't have any letters from that time. But he's moving through Syria and Cilicia. Do you see that there in that right corner, right on the right side here? That's the area he says he's moving through for those 14 years. He establishes more or less another point of focus, another ministry center apart from Jerusalem in Antioch. There, so north, up the coast. And at that point, they say, okay, we really need to get ourselves straight here. So he calls a meeting, which we call the Apostolic Council. And that is 48, I think, right? 48, 49. I'm just checking my dates here. So he and his buddies, about 48. He and some of his co-workers go to Jerusalem to meet with the head honchos, those who actually knew Jesus, right? There's a certain amount of authority granted by proximity, which may or may not equate to accuracy, insight, wisdom, but, and I think we maintain the same ethos today in the church. The older it is, we tend to say, well, that must be a little more true or a little better, right? Or that was actually by this person or someone who knew him, so it's more reliable. I wonder if we might question that assumption about authority. Just an interesting understanding of how we prioritize information. Just something to think about. So they have this council. Basically, they say, okay, we are really on the same page. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. Peter and James and the others are going to focus on the Jews. It's not really resolved, though, because Peter goes to Antioch and, remember, is eating with the Gentiles. And then when some of his brothers from Jerusalem come up, he stops doing that. Paul calls him on this hypocrisy. He says either it's okay or it's not. We don't want to be okay in some circumstances and not okay in others. That's hypocritical. So there's arguments. They seem to have resolved it, but then Barnabas says, you know what, I'm really with Peter on this. I think we need to maintain the two-track system. Paul and Barnabas agree to split ways, and that's where we ended last week, as Paul is going to take the turn from the coast here into Turkey, what is now Turkey, and across into Macedonia and Greece. Okay? Just quickly to remind ourselves, if you need to sort of capture what is Paul on about, he's on about what do we need, how do we make sense of this Jesus event? Okay, I said that last week. How do we make sense of this Jesus event? And that has all sorts of ancillary questions, right? It has questions around the Jew-Gentile-Christian relationship. It has a lot of questions around the law. It has a lot of questions around the end times and Jesus' return. It has a lot of questions on moral behavior, ethical behavior, things like that. So if you need two questions to think about with Paul, he's really serious about what should we believe, the orthodoxy about Jesus, how are we making sense of him theologically, and then how should we behave as a consequence of that, orthopraxis. So and you see that in his letters. There'll be some great theological meditations and then very practical instructions, right? So all of that is there in him. Now, we're going to move to this map for a second here, but I'm going to call up some volunteers here just to get us moving around so I don't talk to you straight at you for 45 minutes. I need a Paul. Who feels like Paul today? This is Edmund, thank you. Edmund, start over there near the window. Who wants to be Galatia? Oh, guys, come on. You got to work with me here. Andrew, you be Galatia. Stand right here, right next to the piano. Thank you. All right. Who wants to be Philippi in Macedonia? David, thank you. You stand on my other side here, okay? Who's going to be Athens? That's a glamorous one. I'm going to call on you. I'm not going to abandon my pedagogical choice. Who's going to be Athens? It's a small part. No one has to say anything. This is just to help dramatize. Ken, thank you very much. Women, I need a Corinth. Oh, come on. Karen, can you be Corinth? Thank you. Stand right over there. Excellent. And that's what we're going to be for today, okay? This is his journey now, okay? So Paul leaves Tarsus, Syria, Antioch, Cilicia, leaves that corner there and starts making his way. This is around 49 to 50 AD. He's had this argument. He says, fine, I'm going, essentially into Europe, which is a different world. Still the Roman Empire, but culturally increasingly different from the world that he was in. All right? So he goes first from, Edmund, from his Syria area. No, come this way and hang out with Andrew for a few minutes. Andrew, you are not a city, you are a region. Galatia is an area. Okay? So he's right here in Galatia. Do you see it here in the middle of Turkey, middle of Asia Minor? And founds probably a number of communities there, not just one. But we have a letter to the Galatians, right? So we're starting to recognize these names from our Bibles. So he's there from about 49 to 50. Okay, so spends some time getting to know the people, teaching, preaching. He then moves on to Macedonia. That's northern Greece, not down in the peninsula or the Peloponnesus, but up in the sort of more mainland area. That's Macedonia. And there's a town called Philippi. So move on to Philippi, Edmund. Okay? With David, Philippi over here. That works. All right, so you guys are hanging out there. Now, in that area, that he establishes the first church that is technically on European soil at that point. Okay, so that's a big transitional point. Philippi, first church on European soil. He continues from there on to Thessalonica. Oh wait, I didn't get a Thessalonica. What? Ken, you're going to be Thessalonica. All right. So you go on to Thessalonica, which is not far, right? Thessalonica was the largest and most important city in Macedonia. It was a port city. It's on the coast there. And it was a commercial center. It had roads going in and out. It had boats going in and out. One of the things to note is Paul is not stupid. Paul wants his message to spread. He wants to go places where people are, right? And so he's going to cities, and he makes his way through a relatively undeveloped area to slightly more developed in Philippi, all the way to a cultural hub, a center, okay? He wants to give his message the best chance of spreading. Spend some time there in Thessalonica. Soon afterwards, moves on to Athens. We're not going to go there because he doesn't write anything to the Athenians, but he moves on to Athens, big, famous city in historical Greece, right? Spends some time there. We don't have any letters, but it is clear that he did form some communities there because he refers back to it at times. So he's in that, another cultural hub, but then moves from there further down the peninsula to Corinth. All right, so you see this journey that he's making going across here? Now, when he gets to Athens and to Corinth, he sends Timothy back to Ken in Thessalonica to sort of check up on them, which is going to be important when we get to the letter to the Thessalonians, okay? So he goes, he stays, he leaves, and he's got people and letters. Those are his ways of staying in touch, okay? There's no phones, obviously, right? There's no Skype, there's no email. Yeah, I know you all know this, but you actually have to think about just how hard it would be to leave a community behind in that place and time and basically just depend on someone being able to walk back there and either give you a verbal report or to bring one of your letters back and forth. That is the form of communication and management, all right? So that's a low bar of success in that sense, all right? Corinth is not far from Athens, so he's down in that very, very Greek world. It was a Roman colony. Latin was the official language there, and it was the largest city in Greece. All right, so Thessalonica up in Macedonia, main city in Macedonia, moving down into Greece, into the biggest cities. Okay, so he's going to those urban centers. It was a leading port. It was an industrial center. There are lots of immigrants. There's a lot of foreign relations coming through there from the west, from the east. It was one of those transitional points. And it must have had some sort of Jewish synagogue. So it has, again, this Greek diaspora. The Jews have been sent out from their promised land and have made homes and places and established themselves in some of these cities, a lot of these cities. And that's often one of the places where he goes. Sometimes even he will find people who have received the Christian message as, again, not technically Christian. That's all in quotes at this point in the history. But as a strand of Judaism within the Jewish communities that are there. Okay? So, almost done there, guys. We have some names of the folks he was with in Corinth. Priscilla and Aquila, they take him in, and Aquila was a fellow tent maker, so Paul could do his work with him. And he would later receive financial support from the churches in Macedonia, that's Philippi, Thessalonica, down while he's in Corinth so that he can stop working and commit himself to missionary work completely. It is also interesting because it seems he gives an indication that Priscilla and Aquila were Jewish Christians who had been run out of Rome. We don't know a lot about them, but he does mention them in a couple of letters, and it seems they were run out of Rome, which is a fascinating question because it's unclear from Paul's letter to the Romans, which happens later, whether there was any already established Christian community there, or whether he's writing to a completely uninformed, let's say, populace. Just an interesting question. There may have been some there. He's there in Corinth for about 18 months, we think. That's from about the fall of 50 to about the spring of 52, and he's got Timothy and Silvanus working with him. And he worked not just in Corinth, but you see there Achaia, Cenchreae, these are other names of places where he says he has planted churches. Okay? So you get this sense of how he has progressed his way through this, sending people and then letters back. All right, you guys can sit down. Thank you very much for your help. Yes.
Was he traveling by road or was he walking?
In this case, he was traveling by either foot or some other form of ground transportation. Yeah. He's not on the boat yet. That happens at the end. Yes.
About how long would those journeys have taken?
It's hard to say, but probably a matter of weeks, if not months. I mean, these are, if you look, I mean, this map is condensed, right? But I mean, like, Turkey's big. It's like really big. And yeah, there's no highway. There are roads, but there's no like paved superhighways. Yeah. Nancy.
Was there anything like inns or these, like established missions in California with the Spanish along with a day's journey? Was there anything like that he might have been stopping at also to share these messages? Or?
Maybe, yes. So here's what I do know. There was, the Romans had a highly developed transportation network, and they even had a postal service. So it was not completely the middle of nowhere with nothing going on. I mean, their entire commerce from the east depended on being able to get the goods and the people from that one part of the empire to the other. And whether it was just the money that they collected and made, like the taxes that are collected have to be sent back and things like that. So there are avenues of transportation. It was not like he was whacking through the bush in a jungle or something. But it was still pretty onerous, you could say. Andrew, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to point out that they did in fact have roadside taverns, some of which may have been run by Christians secretly, but most of them just were ordinary secular.
That's cool. Andrew, I'm repeating it because I've forgotten to repeat the questions already, but for the recording. Andrew's saying there were established roadside taverns or way stations along the way, some of whom may have been run by Christians secretly but not openly, which is a fascinating question about how the message sort of was, how the seeds were scattered along the way as he went there. Yes?
I've heard about what's called the Silk Road. Was that something in the...
Some of this would have been Silk Road. I believe is not entirely Roman. There's other periods of time that it was used for. That is how you're getting all the way to the east, like into China and everywhere, to get goods and commerce back into Europe. But yes, some of those roads that the Romans established had been already used or established for commercial purposes. And some of them are using boats, some of them are using, animals pulling things, things like that. Dan?
They refer more to from here to there rather than a path, a beaten path.
Yeah.
That's the way it went.
Yeah, there was sort of, it was
It was a bunch of people
moving together.
moving, like just sort of stomping on the grass, and they could get distinct clearing in the grass or the forest.
Right. It's like a deer run, right? It's not as, there are agreed upon ways, but how formalized those physical spaces were, I think, is probably not so much. So his MO, Paul's MO here, is that he had a few tested and trusted associates who would with him settle in a capital or center of a province or region, and first gather any other Christians that were in the area, and expand his staff, if you will, and say, okay, I'm here, and we've got some work to do, and with their help would establish these congregations. And then they would help spread that into other areas of the province. Now, congregations is perhaps a little bit grand for it. They were more or less house churches based in households, which is more than like, a mom and dad and some kids. There are servants, there are other members. So households, it's bigger, but also maybe not as big as you might think, is say like we're planting churches along the way here. This is really just communities of people who agree to act and practice in a certain way and believe certain things. The formality comes much later. The structure, the formality comes much later. So you've got to sort of get that out of your head. But this was organized and well-structured and well-planned, and it was somewhat large-scale, given the distance that we're talking about here, missionary work. He was not just wandering aimlessly. I just want to, if you have that picture of Paul just sort of saying, I'm just going to follow where the Spirit goes, and end up somewhere, and oh, look, here I am. And no, he had a plan, he had people, and you can see that in his letters, right? He said, I want to come here, but first I have to go there, or I've heard from these people that I need to follow up with them. And so, I mean, he's organized, and he's no dummy, like I'm saying. One second, Nancy, let me get through this part, and then we'll take a few more questions here. So he hits these places, establishes these communities, and then has to stay in touch with them, like I said. So he has some people he sends as runners back and forth, but the way that he communicates with them, because he's got lots of these places, is through letters, right? So before we look at the letters themselves, I just want to talk about letters in general. Again, all his letters predate the written Gospels. They don't necessarily predate stories of Jesus, they certainly don't, but they predate the written down gospel versions that we have of Jesus' life. Think for a second, I said this last week, but you can't emphasize it enough. Think about the genre of the letter. It is a personal document based on relationship, usually. It's much more, it can be very formal, but it is a very borderline intimate form of communication. Most letters are written between people who know each other, and if it's a real substantive letter, provide some portion, if not a whole lot, of that person on the page. Right? That's part of what's being communicated. It's not hidden. There's no scholarly, dispassionate sort of academic approach to these things. It's emotional. Right? It's also not always systematic in the way that it's composed or in the structure in which it's saying. So you'll see Paul is not always systematic and sometimes contradicts himself, and that is somewhat understandable based upon the fact that he's not writing a systematic theology here. He's writing a letter to people who he's trying to help and trying to inspire or criticize or whatever it may be. So we have a lot of him on the page as far as an individual, a person, a personality, a character. And that's why I think we know so much of him, and he starts to take shape in our minds very clearly, and yet we have to contend with an individual and his personal or particular views or understandings or ideas, right? As opposed to saying, I'm going to gather all the evidence and discern through the data and sort of collect it, and then I'll give you, say, well, some people think this and some people think that. It's not meant to be a balanced presentation of an argument. It's meant to be his thoughts and his impressions. Now, what to do with that? Well, that's up to us, but we need to understand and recognize that. It also, though, makes these letters very readable. And one of the things that's the most fun is to read a letter from Paul because it sounds like a letter. It sounds like a letter that you might write. I mean, if you were super inspired and really zealous for the gospel. I mean, yeah. And a little grumpy. But you can tell there are human beings behind the papyrus, if you will. Okay? So that is really, I find that really cool and really interesting. So it's a window into not just a time and a place, but a person. Okay? So I would encourage you, read, if you have some, they're not that long, most of them. Read them through. And don't get hung up on the various theological permutations, but just read it like you were getting a letter from a loved one or someone you trusted or respected. And all of a sudden, that thing will transport 2,000 years in a second in your mind. Now, some of their structure and their content, because there is a structure and the content does have some forms here. The letters always open with some form of salutation because they're a letter. Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother. So Paul and Timothy, to Philemon, our dear friend and co-worker, to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. This is the letter to Philemon, the opening. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. From, to, these are the people that are involved in this conversation. They often include a lot of mundanities in them. They're not all high-flying rhetoric here. He talks to them about how to make their donations, right? How are we going to figure out this money thing and what his travel plans are? And these parts are rarely part of our lectionary cycle, but they're worth reading because they actually help you see how he's organizing and structuring this whole thing. So, for example, from 1 Corinthians. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, that is, all the people in Jerusalem, the believers, you should follow the directions I gave to the churches of Galatia. On the first day of every week, which is Sunday, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you earn so that collections need not be taken when I come. So put a little bit away every week, and when I come, we'll collect it, and we're going to deliver it to Jerusalem. Then he says, I will visit you after passing through Macedonia. He's writing to the Corinthians. We'll put this where this happens in his story later. But he's writing to the Corinthians. Macedonia is up north. He said, I want to pass through Macedonia, but then I'm going to come to you, for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I go. But I will stay in Ephesus, that's coming later, until Pentecost. For a wide door, remember Pentecost was a Jewish celebration before it was a Christian celebration. For a wide door of effective work has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. All right, so he's saying, I'm going to come, I'm going to go through, this is the route I'm going to take, but I don't know exactly when I'm leaving because I have to do some work here first. I mean, sounds a little bit like you trying to plan a vacation with your family to the West Coast or something like that. We're going to come there, but we're going to stop in Denver because we want to see my college roommate, and then I'm going to get there. I'm not sure. I can't book the tickets yet because I'm not sure when we're going to leave because I have a few things I need to finish up at the office first. Right? I mean, so like that's what's happening here. All right?
But we're putting some money aside for when I get there.
That's right. Yes. And just so you know, I'm not going back empty-handed. That's right, Dan. Yeah, so put that money aside so that I don't have to do it all at once. He's really just trying to help them budget, sort of say, we don't want this to be a big lump sum. We want to have it accrue over time. All right, often there was some divisive issue or cause or reason for his writing. He may have just been writing to check up, but usually he's writing in response to some report that he has gotten. Here's again from 1 Corinthians. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you should be in agreement. And there should be no divisions among you, but you should be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people, that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. So he gets this report and he says, I got to write something to them because sounds like there's some issues, okay? Now, he often included things for his hopes, for how things were going or would go, and this is my prayer, he writes in Philippians, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight to help you determine what is best, so that on the day of Christ you may be pure and blameless, having produced the harvest of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ for the glory and praise of God. That's encouragement, right? He's saying, I want you guys to keep it up because this is really good stuff. But also he can chastise somewhat aggressively. You foolish Galatians! Literally, who has bewitched you? And we'll talk about why he says that to them in a second. But sometimes he does get good reports, like from Timothy, after he visits the Thessalonians, comes back and says, here's what they're dealing with. They're actually doing a pretty good job. But Timothy has just now come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love. For this reason, brothers and sisters, during all our distress and persecution, we have been encouraged about you through your faith. So he's saying, good job. And then in Thessalonians, which we'll talk about in a second, he works through some issues that have arisen. Do you see how these are letters? And there's interesting components of this. There's high rhetoric and beautiful, inspiring stuff, and then very specific, very mundane as well. This is why I find them really interesting to read and to enjoy. Now, these letters were often sent in the company of one of his co-workers who would read them in the presence of the congregation. They didn't have copies they could distribute to everybody, right? These were received more or less orally with a written copy to leave behind. And they would be cherished and they would be held onto. That's how some of them were maintained and kept. Now, that means there were also almost assuredly others that were lost or just did not, stand the test of time. So we have but a fraction of these correspondences, just to remember, okay? So I want you to step back for a second before we get into the letters themselves and just reflect with me on how just impossible this must have been. So you go traveling through not terribly helpful or enjoyable land to spend days or weeks or months or maybe even years in a foreign city where you might know a couple of people, but probably not. You have to establish those relationships, Many of those people that you're encountering probably have no acquaintance even with Judaism, let alone Christianity as an offshoot of it. And especially if you're going to go to those Gentiles and those people specifically. And so you've got to establish inroads there with people and convince them to join a religion that was increasingly despised both by the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. These are people who are living otherwise, probably safe and healthy lives. And they are going to choose to live in a certain way and abide by certain practices and believe certain things that could get them arrested or eventually thrown to the wild beasts for sport. Right? And then you leave. And your only contact with them is an occasional letter that someone reads to you on, after a year or two or some months. Can you believe that we have a church? It is a miracle. Everything was set up for this to fail. And somehow, for some reason, be it the Holy Spirit or an accident of history, you can argue about it yourselves, but I believe there was something in the message that latched onto people and made them willing to make these commitments and sacrifices and to stick with it. Now, there was a lot of effort, there was a lot of energy expended by Paul, but ultimately it was the spirit of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ that somehow permeated the entire, what was then, major component of the Western world. I remember when I was in biology class and they asked, what is the age range through which there's the largest amount of growth for a person? And we all said, well, adolescence, right? You go from, 4 feet tall to 8 feet tall. And they said, no, it's from inception to birth. It's those 9 months. I would say the same is true for the church. To go from where it did, its inception, to by around the year 300, being accepted, and by the end of the 300, so let's give it a 400-year window, to being the predominant religion within the largest empire in the Western world, and then even that level of growth is staggering and astonishing. Now, I don't know. I haven't checked the percentages and stuff like that. It then goes on to spread across the world, but you have to think about just where it came from and where it ended up within those first few hundred years. It's just incredible. And we are here 2,000 years later, and even that is incredible given its origins. So don't take that for granted. It's also a good reminder as you read Paul's letters that the formation of community and communities was always at the heart of this. Paul gets read by many as the sort of progenitor of individual salvation, right? This is an individual relationship with God, and if you just believe in God, you will be saved, and don't worry about it. I think that's a misreading. There is that in there, but it is always in service of your transformation of an individual so that you may be of service to the community. And that these communities are emblematic of this new way of living, which is this law of love that is now, to him, the only law that applies. So, community is central. All right, I'm going to talk about Thessalonians for a few minutes here and bring us up to his arrival in Ephesus, and then we'll pause for questions, okay? So, if you remember, Edmund made his way around, went to Thessalonica, then moved on to Athens and to Corinth, right? And from Athens, sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to say, how are they doing? Check up on them. Probably only a few months after. And Timothy comes back once Paul has moved to Corinth. So Timothy finds him not in Athens but in Corinth and gives him this report. It's only really then a few months after his establishment of this community. And this is, the reason we're focusing on 1 Thessalonians, which you may or may not have read, it is the oldest of the New Testament documents. It is his first letter that we have. Probably not his first letter, almost assuredly not his first letter, but the first letter that we have, around the year 50 to 52, sort of in that window. The challenges that are the occasion for Paul writing are challenges that you would find within a nascent community trying to discern and figure out how to live by a certain new rule. The first challenge that he has to face is his own integrity as an apostle. Why should we believe you? Why should we listen to your message? There are lots of people in this day and age going around selling their version of salvation and working wonders and doing interesting things. Why should we trust him? So he's left, and as you can imagine, after a few days or weeks or months, they say, he was good, but was he really that good? It's a natural question, right, for you to ask when someone left. And you say, well, he said these things, or what did he say about that? Or there's this other guy saying this. How do I make sense of all this information I'm getting here? So how he distinguishes himself, and he does it here and in other examples, is that he did not preach for personal gain. He says he's not receiving money for this. He makes a commitment to that. The purpose of his teaching is not, first and foremost, the sort of self-improvement. There were plenty of self-improvement, self-empowering gurus, even back then, 2,000 years ago, trying to make people feel good about their own selves. He is primarily concerned with establishing a community that is bound together by mutual love. He is not the center of that community, he makes clear, which is tricky, right? How do you, as an individual, form a community and educate and empower people enough so that they can feel like they have ownership over it, and then remove yourself while also hoping they maintain? That's a tricky spot to be in. And we'll see that in some of his later letters. He's got to argue for himself without wanting to argue for himself. I don't want to boast, but I need to boast because you're kind of asking me to, as far as why you should listen to me. So he's not the center of that community. He's sort of just an example of the way the common love and care should function, and he wants them to keep that faith and love. So he uses a lot of, in 1 Thessalonians, a lot of family metaphors, paternal family metaphors about connecting to each other in that way. And there are outsiders who are hostile to this new group. So they're also facing people who are kind of upset that they're trying to follow this new way. So internally there are questions, externally there are threats, and he responds to that by saying, I told you that persecution was going to be a part of this, and actually that gives you a share of what the other churches are going through. So he pivots it into it being a point of connection rather than persecution. To say, there are people in Galatia going through that too. There are people here in Corinth going through that too. There are people in Judea and Jerusalem going through that as well. And so you need to know that you're not alone in that persecution, and I also too am suffering for this. Is that a successful message? I don't know, but that's how he goes about doing it. And then there's questions about how to behave, their moral conduct, to say, okay, what exactly are we supposed to do with these new rules you gave us? And then there are questions in 1 Thessalonians about, how long are we supposed to do this for? Like, when is Jesus coming back? Was it soon? Was it a lot? And that's where he says, it's going to be the thief in the night. We're not going to know, but keep it up. In the meantime, keep going. We'll let you know when it's here. You won't miss it. And then what about people who are dying? Like, these people you came, you preached to, and they said Jesus would be here before you died, and some of them are dying. How do we make sense of that? And he says they'll be okay when Jesus returns as Lord of living and the dead. He'll be able to reach them too. So it's mostly personal in nature, but these are the sort of questions. And can you imagine if you were in Thessalonica at this time, these may have been your very same questions as you're trying to establish your identity as a part of this community, which is adjacent to any other community you've been before. Live quietly, love one another as you await this second coming. That's what's going on. Okay? At that point, so Paul is in Corinth, writing this letter back to the Thessalonians up in Macedonia. In the spring of 52, he leaves Corinth and makes his way back through Galatia, maybe with a stop. So pull out your map, because we're going to get back out here. So he's left the Peloponnesus, moved his way back up through Macedonia, over back into Asia, into Galatia. He may have, it's unclear, he may have taken a little detour and stopped off in Antioch to check back in with those people, but can't quite pin that down. But eventually comes to Ephesus. Do you see Ephesus right in the middle of that page there on the western edge of Turkey? Okay? He gets there by the fall of 52. Okay, so the fall of 52. He started, remember, the travels in 49. He spent a few years traveling around now, and it ends up in Ephesus. Acts 18 and 19 indicates that some form of Christianity had made it to Ephesus by then. There was someone called Apollos who was teaching. There were disciples of John the Baptist that somehow seemed distinguished from disciples of Jesus. So they had somehow the incomplete story and needed to be educated on the fullness of what was going on there. So, where's my page here? Sorry. There we go. Paul sets up in Ephesus and stays there for over 2 years, which is a long time, 2 years and 3 months. And that becomes the new center of his missionary activity as he continues to form things, but also that's where we have all his letters. The letters that we have, most of the rest of the letters are written from there. To the Galatians, Corinthians, a number of times, the Philippians, and probably to Philemon, who's an individual. We'll look at that letter in the next week or two. Now, there are opponents to this work. There's religious propaganda that is rampant across the ancient world, as I told you, and that Paul was not alone in his missionary efforts, even among the Jews. And remember, there's no line separating the Jews and the Christians yet. There's no fixed doctrine or church structure at this point. And even Judaism is not the Judaism we recognize, which came into being after the destruction of the temple in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. That's rabbinic Judaism, based on particular teachers and synagogues and gatherings outside of Jerusalem. It takes a different form. Their scripture is the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of those Hebrew scriptures. But it really is this wide open competition between Jews, Gentiles, and now him speaking on behalf, and a few others speaking on behalf of this Christian identity. There were other eloquent speakers and miracle workers and magicians and people with claims to ancient authority. All of that was pretty widespread. So Paul is competing not just against the legal threats from Rome or the religious threats from Judaism, but even among the sort of cadre of traveling salesmen, if you will, who were going through. So that's the context in which he arrives in Ephesus, and then gets reports or has to write letters back to, and this is probably the order based upon their content, the Galatians, the Corinthians, and then to the Philippians and Philemon. Romans is written later, okay? So bracket that for a second. We'll get to that in a week or two, okay? So we're going to leave off in Ephesus with this first part of his missionary activity concluded. And next week, we're going to take a look at the letters themselves, and I'll summarize some of the issues so that you can see, like I did with 1 Thessalonians, these are some basic questions about organization, structure, and belief by a very new community. That's, if you go back home this week and read 1 Thessalonians with that idea in mind, and it'll just jump off the page at you. You'll be like, oh, I can see this now. Okay, so that's your homework if you want homework. All right, we have a couple minutes for questions here. Yes, excuse me, Frank.
How do we know these dates as opposed to January 2nd, or that letter Jesse wrote me on my birthday?
How do we know those dates? We know them if you really trace down his journeys and how he refers to where he's been. Part of why they're a little fudged is because, like I said, does that 14 years that he talks about include the 3 years in Arabia or not? But we can fix his departure from Corinth coming up. I don't have my notes right ahead of me here, but when he leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus, he's sort of run out, and I don't have the citation, but you're able to say that happened in 52. So we sort of work backwards. We add those 14 years or so after 33, thinking that he got his conversion around 35. We add those 14 years, we're in 48, 49. There's also a tricky part. In those times, they didn't count years the way we do necessarily. So if it was like half a year on either end, those got counted as full years. So you could be as many as or as few as 10 or as many as 12 and still be the same date range, depending on how you were counting. So there's some fungibility to it. But we know the dates based upon a couple of fixed points that we can articulate based upon historical knowledge around certain events or something that happened. So it's a little bit of a math problem and a puzzle there. Yeah, Trish and then Nancy.
This is a weird question, but what do you think would happen if archaeologists in Corinth, all of a sudden, or in Ephesus, said, oh my gosh, we found this trunk, and it's full of these letters from
Oh,
the
man.
side.
Yeah. What do I think would happen? I think people would lose their minds. So what would happen if they found some new cache of Pauline letters? It's a wonderful question. If you go to the grocery store, I don't know, Time Magazine apparently has a whole side business with like sort of questionable biblical scholarship that they're selling to you. But I mean, people are on the hunt. I mean, this happened to a certain extent with the Old Testament with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I don't know if you guys remember that, but like they found a whole bunch of new scrolls, and it informed a whole new generation of scholarship on it. So I think that would. I think people would freak out a little bit. Some of them would get very, very rich. And then there would be a whole digestion. And what does that mean in relationship to what we already have? They'd have to authenticate them, et cetera, et cetera. We all saw what happened with the Jesus' wife papyrus and all that. So yeah, I think that would be part of it. Nancy, question?
Yeah, mine is related, a little bit related to that too. When we talk about the letters, you said you have a fragment of it. Were these actual documents that they found, or were these just word of mouth for a while and then they were put into so-called scripture?
That's a good question.
I mean, you mentioned something about the Eliot speech and all that. Have they been, doctored through the years by translators?
There's some indication that some of the letters have been messed around with, but we'll talk more about the what they call sort of the text history itself later on as we talk to sort of this transitioning out of these individual letters to individual communities or groups of communities into what we would call more like scripture. No one has an original now, if that makes sense. No one has like, this is the letter to the Galatians. But they were collected and held onto, at least the ones we have, such that when it came time to transfer them into more of a collected form, they were working from either, maybe not original sources, but close sources transcribed along the way. And yes, but they were physical pieces of papyrus with sort of ink on them that would be taken and read and then held onto and kept in various states of good repair. Yeah, can I get Dan and then we'll come here? And I also we got to get going to church in a minute here. Yeah, Dan.
We hear about these letters too.
Yeah. There's some indication that he did get some letters back from people, and I think it might have been the Galatians. But yes, there are indications that it was not only a one-way correspondence. But next week we'll have some fun because you can see him like his actual words are just it's fun. I find it fun. Maybe you don't find it fun. It's fun to see what he's saying because you can almost picture him sitting there. And so to see what big letters I make with my hand. He gets really aggravated at the Corinthians. Well, that's like a spoiler alert. And he's just like, he can't do anything but yell at them on the page. Right? He says, see, you got me all worked up. It's like basically what he says. Like, look, I'm writing extra big in this part. So it's very much this physical document that's being transferred. Yeah. Nancy, last question.
And you may cover this later, but when you were talking about the churches and gathering people's homes, what would a service be like? Would they be following the Jewish service and then insert the Christian message?
Maybe I may bring that in at the end, maybe our last class. There's some, Justin Martyr wrote a sort of apologia in the early, is it 150 or so? So it's about 100 years after this. So we don't have a direct picture of what it looked like for Paul, but it probably was some reading of Scripture, the sharing of a ritual meal, prayers, and then a collection. The earliest indications we have of the structure of a service, like a worship service, you'd see the bones of it in what we do every Sunday here, with fancier robes. Okay. All right, I'm going to release this all because we got to get ready for church. Thank you all for your time. We'll continue on next week into the letters and make our way on with Paul through his journeys. Thank you very much.